Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session. We will talk about the business and economic potential of the Muslim population in Europe. I would like to thank all people who took some part of the time in order to attend it, especially Dr. Yo for the organization of this session, and also for people from ESSEC, and especially Mr. Baudet coming from France concerning this. So, talking about the economic and business potential of the Muslim population in Europe is not an easy topic because every time that we talk about Islam in Europe, we automatically talk about political questions, we talk about social questions, we talk about some other questions, but we usually don't tackle this one, which could be a very important one. So, in order to assess the potential of one population, we have to look at two sets of criteria. The first one is looking at demography, and the second one is looking at purchasing power. Only if we have a critical combination of the number of people, that is the potential customers, and the purchasing power on the other side, we can talk about one significant potential in a given country or in a given region. This is why we will divide this presentation in two parts. We'll first talk about the demographic state, and afterwards we talk about the business opportunities. Concerning the demographic approach, here you have some figures which come from the Pew Research Center in the United States, because the problem that we have concerning Europe is that in the great number of European countries, we cannot have definite statistics about the number of Muslims living in these countries. Why so? It is usually illegal to gather statistics which are based on religious preference. So in that case, we can only have estimates about the number of Muslims living in a certain number of countries. So far, the Pew Research Center and the forum they have on religion and religious life is considered to be the best compilation of all sources that we can have concerning the religious life. It can be regarding Islam, it can be regarding Christianity, it can be regarding Buddhism and so on. So if you have some time and if you are really interested in religious issues, it is really worth looking at the website of the Pew Research Center, because you will get the updated information, and they collect information coming from the whole world, they synthesize it afterwards, and this is the result. So when we look at the situation that we have here, we can focus on the evolution for the 40 years, starting in 1990s and going to the years 2030. So what is the evolution? The overall population in Europe is expected to go down. So this is the first thing that we have to mention. On the other side, the Muslim population will go up. So when you combine both of these trends, in that case we expect that in the year 2030, the Muslim population in Europe will represent as much as 8% of total European population, compared to the situation in 2010, 6%, or the situation in 1990, 4.1%. When we talk about absolute numbers, in that case, from the year 1990 to the year 2030, we practically double the number of Muslims living in Europe. So when we look at these figures, it means that there is no company, there is no institution, there is no business sector which is not interested in this. Because on one side, the overall population is shrinking, and on the other side, the Muslim population in Europe is increasing. The next point, also coming from the Pew Research Center, is emphasizing the fact that this progression of the Muslim population, of course, is due to the shrinking of the overall population, but also to the fact that the growth rates are not so big as the stereotype would tell us to be. Because when we talk about Muslim populations in Europe or outside, we usually think about large families. That is, for instance, 6, 7, even 8 members of family. This is not the case here because the average growth rate will pass from 2.2% to 1.2%. Will practically divide by 2 the growth rate concerning the Muslim population in Europe. Of course, the overall population in Europe will also go down by the same period, but when we look only at the Muslim population, it is following the trend of the aging population that we have in other European countries, especially when we compare it to Germany or to some other countries. The next slide is talking about the percentage of population which is professing Islam in different European countries. If we start with the first one, if for instance Kosovo is a country recognized by the United Nations, you know that currently this is a would-be country, still not recognized, but it is going on the way. So it means 93% of the population is a Muslim one. Afterwards, we have Albania, 83, we have Bosnia and Herzegovina, 42, Republic of Macedonia, 40%, and so on and so on. What does it mean? It means that if we talk about Muslims living in Europe, there is a general trend only to talk about Western countries. That is to talk about France, to talk about Germany, to talk about Spain, or to talk about UK. This is where the large part of the Muslim population lives in Western countries. But we usually forget about European countries where Muslims represent the majority. Would it be an absolute majority or would it be a relative majority? It means that in Europe we have 2 types of countries. There are countries where Islam is the main religion, and there are countries where Islam is usually the second religion. And when we talk about the second religion, we are not passing by, for instance, 10 or 11% of population. While in other countries, especially concerning former Yugoslavia, in that case, and Albania, we have more than 40% or more than 80% of the population. In terms of business, it means that in the first category of countries here, what companies will offer is for the majority of the population. While in the other case, we talk about a minority of the population. Automatically, the political consequences or the social consequences are not the same ones. If you offer, for instance, Islamic finance in Bosnia, or if you offer Islamic finance in Belgium, the reception coming from the mass media or coming from the political leaders won't be the same. In Bosnia, it will be widely accepted in the part where Muslims represent the majority, while in Belgium or in France, there would be a strong reluctance against that. And it was just a few weeks ago, I was in Paris, in the Chamber of Commerce in Paris, and there was a discussion concerning Islamic finance, and after half an hour of business discussion, it has been transformed into a political discussion because it was impossible to continue to talk only about business. We have immediately demands concerning the political discussion about that. So these figures are quite important in order to measure that we have 2 types of countries, countries where Muslims represent the majority and countries where they represent a small minority. Now, if I'm showing this here, it is because Russia today is the country with the biggest Muslim population in Europe, provided that Russia is considered to be a European country. This country is always somewhere between Asia and Europe, but if we include Russia in Europe, as it was included by the Pew Research Center, in that case, this is definitely the country with the biggest Muslim population in Europe. Now, we have exactly the same approach as for the other European countries. The Russian population is also shrinking, while the Muslim population is expanding in Russia. And exactly as in the other countries, we also expect that in absolute terms, but also in relative terms, in terms of percentage, the Muslim population will grow in Russia. When we look at this big country as Russia is, you will find three areas for the Muslim population. The first one would be here. It will be in the Caucasus. If Caucasus was a separate area, in that case maybe it will not be included in Europe. But since it is part of the Russian Federation, we'll consider that it is part of Europe. So we have a certain number of autonomous republics within Russia, that is in the Caucasus area, where Muslims represent the majority of population. And this is, of course, very famous now with the Boston bombs, since you know that the two suspects come from this very region. So this is one big Muslim region in Europe, in Russia. The second one is located here in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. So these are the two areas in the central part of Russia. And the last, third one is Moscow. Moscow is today considered to be the European city with the largest Muslim population. We don't have estimates, we don't have statistics about that. But when you ask people who are in charge of the Muslim population in Moscow, we talk about more than 1.5 million people, Muslim people living in Moscow. So we have 3 points. In terms of business, it's absolutely not the same thing. Because Tatarstan, for instance, will be quite rich in natural resources when we talk about oil and when we talk about gas. So in that case, offering Islamic products and services to people in Tatarstan would make sense. For the people living in Moscow, their purchasing power is also quite interesting and much higher than for the people living here in the Caucasus. So again, the distribution of the Muslim population is not only looking at the territorial distribution, that is geography, but also at the purchasing power, and this purchasing power is absolutely not the same one. We'll finish concerning these figures by talking about some European countries. The first one will be France. Why France? Because France is the home of the biggest Muslim population in Europe after Russia. So if we exclude Russia, in that case France is the biggest one. It means that every time that something is happening in France, that we have a scandal about halal food, for instance, or that we have a discussion about the whale in France, the whole Muslim world is scrutinizing what is happening in France, because this can be used practically as a blueprint for some other countries. So this is why the French situation is so sensitive that for political leaders, but also for Muslim leaders in France, it is quite difficult to find the right balance when they have to offer something in the country. What are the figures here? The figures do not only look at the natural increase of the population, but also about immigration in France. We have about 66,000 Muslim immigrants every year going to France. And we don't talk about illegal immigrants. We talk about legal immigration. This legal immigration is based on one concept which is called family grouping. Family grouping means that if you have an immigrant who has a regular status in France, he has a sufficient income and he has a sufficient house, that is the size of the house, he or she can invite the other members of the family to come to France. And in that case, they legally come to France. So we have to put aside the fact that all immigration going to Europe or going to France is automatically illegal. This is not the case. We have this legal family grouping, about 66,000 Muslims going to France, and especially coming from North Africa, because this is where the majority of the Muslim population in France comes from. Concerning Spain, we have also a continuing immigration going to Spain, but in Spain there were some changes recently. So the immigration coming from Latin America is becoming now much bigger than immigration coming from North Africa. So in that case, the Muslim population as part of the immigrants going to Spain will represent about 30%, 15% of the population, while for France it will represent 68.5%. And finally, concerning UK, UK has a net influx of new Muslims, practically the same number that we have in France, about 64,000. And this is also expected to continue for the next years. So not only the Muslim population in Europe is expected to grow on a, let's say, intrinsic basis, that is through natural increase, but we also have legal immigration going to these countries, and this will also give a potential for the business that we have there. Finally, some figures about countries that we have. So all these figures come from the Pew Research Center. And of course, we can have some, let's say, questions about the figures. Are they representative? Aren't they representative about what is going on, and so on? What is interesting to note is that if there is a ranking of different European countries, France would be first, Germany would be second, and UK would be third. But when we talk about UK, UK cannot represent more than 50% of the Muslim population that we have in France or in Germany. So it means there is a strong hierarchy. I understand that in Southeast Asia, let's say from the Singaporean point of view, when we talk about Europe or when we talk about Muslims living in Europe, we will automatically think about UK because of the strong history, because of the colonization process and so on. But when we look at figures, UK is definitely the third country. Now, when we look at the opportunities, especially concerning the year 2030, if the population in UK, the Muslim population in UK is expected to double from the year 2010 to the year 2030. This would be a revolution, because in that case, the number of Muslims living in UK would be practically the same one as the number of Muslims living in Germany, or maybe even higher. And it will be the first time in history that this will happen. So in that case, when we have to look at the opportunities, where to go in order to open a business, when we address the Muslim populations, UK can be a very good starting point. If we do it today, in the year 2013, we don't see why people will go to UK first when you have better opportunities going to France or going to Germany. I will give you an example of this region when they asked me where to go first, and we discussed about the question about United Kingdom. When we look at the distribution of Muslims in several countries, we'll take these two examples coming from England on one side and France on the other side. Concerning England, we'll have two strong places. The first one would be London, and the second one would be Birmingham. Many people consider Birmingham to be the capital city of Muslims in UK. So, but it is because of the concentration. The fact concerning London is that we have a higher number of people living in London, but we take the Great London, while Birmingham is much smaller. So this is why people prefer to talk about Birmingham rather than to talk about London. And when it comes to France, in that case, we'll have three areas. The first one would be the northern part of France here, between Paris and going here to Lille, for instance. The second one will be here in the region of Lyon, and the third one will be here concerning Marseille and Côte d'Azur. So again, we have a strong concentration. So in terms of business, this will also have a consequence because you don't need to be present on the whole territory. If we look at the question here concerning England, you can say I will have two bases. One would be in London, another one would be in Birmingham. If I go to France, I will have three places and that's it. I don't need to be present on the whole territory. I will waste time, I will waste money if necessary, so I would prefer to do something else. Now, we have to address the identification issue of Muslims living in Europe, because we have these two groups. We have the group coming from the Balkan area, and we have the group coming from Western Europe. What is the difference between these two groups? It is because they don't make reference to the same period where Muslims established their presence in Europe. The Muslim presence in Europe is quite old. We usually believe that it is starting after the Second World War, but that's not true, because from the very beginning of the expansion of Islam, we have a presence, especially here in Spain, with Al-Andalus. So starting with the early years of the 8th century, we have a Muslim presence in Europe, in Spain and in Portugal. And they were staying here up to the Reconquista, that is up to the 15th century, when they have been expelled from what we know as Spain today. So it means that from the very beginning, we have a Muslim presence there many years before Islam was expanded to Southeast Asia, that is to the region that we have here. So in that case, when we look at the identification of Muslims, and when we look at the spatial distribution, they can say there is at least one part of Europe, that is Spain and Portugal, which can be considered to be Muslim centers at the same importance, or maybe even more important than Jakarta, KL, or something else, because they have been Islamicized much more before than other centers. The second wave is dating back to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is reflecting to especially the 15th century, 15th and 16th century. The 16th century, with the acquisitions that we have with Solomon the Magnificent, and we have another part of Europe which is now identified with Islam. And this part of Europe is located here, that is the Balkan area that we know today. So we are in the 16th century. So on one side we have Al-Andalus from the 8th to the 15th century, and we have the relay, the bypass coming from the Balkans from the 16th century up to now. So it means that Islam is not new in Europe. This is not a new religion. It is much older than in some other parts of the world. Now the difference is that we don't have the same persons. We have a great diversity of persons professing Islam. When we look at the breakdown of this Muslim population, here you have the breakdown concerning Western countries. Where do they come from? Sorry, you can't see it very well, but we have the general trends. The general trend is that the majority of Muslims today in Germany, originate from Turkey. The majority of Muslims living in France originate from North Africa, namely three countries, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And concerning UK, the great majority of them will come from the Indian Peninsula. So in that case, we have one great diversity of populations. This great diversity of populations will obviously pose some kinds of problems because they are not attached to the same branch of Islam. Especially if we look at the situation concerning Germany. It is the only country in Europe where we will have a significant portion of Iranians, more than 125,000. We suppose that they are Shiites at the same time. So while practically all other would be Sunni, this one would be the Shia Islam present in Europe. And concerning the Sunni Islam, they will be divided according to the schools of fiqh that I will talk a little bit later on. So, this is the situation that we have concerning the population. Concerning the business now, we can have two types of businesses. The first one is the usual business that we have, which is the same one for all people. And we don't care if they are Muslim or if they are something else. This kind of business may be selling computers, maybe selling Coca-Cola, maybe selling something else. So in that case, we address everyone and we don't make a difference. So in that case, it would be very hard to establish a segmentation criterion which is based on religion. We'll put this aside. When we talk about specific businesses, we have two of them. The first one would be Islamic finance, and the second one would be halal food. Concerning Islamic finance, this business today represents about $1,300 billion a year. This is a huge amount, $1,300 billion. So this amount is spread in several countries, and one of the leading countries is a nearby Malaysia, which is a champion of Islamic finance. So today in Western Europe, except UK, we practically do not have Islamic finance which is based on retail banking. Why don't we have retail banks when we have practically 5 million Muslims living in Germany and we have up to, let's say, 7 or 8 million Muslims living in France? 7 or 8 million Muslims is bigger than some Muslim population in the Organization of Islamic Conference. So if in these countries we can have Islamic retail banking, why don't we have Islamic retail banking in France or in Germany? In that case, we have to look at the drivers of Islamic finance. Is it motivated by market? Is it motivated by the government? Or is it motivated by individuals? Some banks in France, for instance, investigated the possibility to open an Islamic retail bank. And they are coming to the conclusion that it was impossible. Why so? Because they computed that they needed 250,000 customers to open a bank. And they said, we cannot find them. The answer was, how cannot you find them among 8 million people? And they say, that's okay. We have 8 million Muslims, but not all of them know what Islamic finance is. And not all of them are interested in Islamic finance. So today, we have a big flow concerning the awareness of Islamic finance in Western Europe. All Muslims in Western Europe know what is Ramadan, what is Zakat, what is halal food, but they don't know what is Islamic finance. So this is a problem. You cannot open a bank if they don't know what is Islamic finance. The second thing is how to find the different customers. Again, we cannot use files, we cannot use statistics, because they are forbidden from the political and legal point of view. However, we can have some estimates. There are some businesses, for instance in Paris, because I discussed with some mutual insurance companies, and they are insuring small and medium-sized companies. And they told me that a significant part of owners of small and medium-sized companies are Muslims. I asked them, do you have statistics? They say, of course not. This is only a perception that we can have. So we have some businesses where there is a concentration and other businesses where we don't have this concentration. But anyway, for a bank to open a retail bank, they need a minimum number of people, and so far we don't have them. So maybe we'll have a business for the sukuk, which is the Islamic bond. But the sukuk doesn't need customers, it needs investors. So it's a completely different option when we have to look at the potential concerning the business. The second business that I will look at is halal food. Halal food, all Muslims are supposed to know what is halal food. But when you ask questions, you find out maybe it's not the case all the time. So when we talk about halal food, in that case, we can have some statistics. And the statistics will come from, let's say, some institutions. And those institutions are, for instance, Qasidia, coming from Malaysia, or the International Halal Integrity Alliance, which also comes from Malaysia. Here you have the size of the halal food market in Europe. It is considered to be at about $66 billion. $66 billion, it is 3 times the halal food business in Malaysia. So it means that for all companies which are interested to be in the halal business, they cannot miss the opportunities which are coming from Europe. The problem is that Europe is fragmented. When we look at the number of countries, it is also fragmented when we look at where do these people come from. But 66 billion is something which is extremely interesting, especially when we compare it to the situation in North America, or when we compare it to the situation in some other, let's say, non-Muslim countries. So it means that we have a very strong basis. We have a very strong starting base for business, especially concerning halal food. And the problem that we can have is the fragmentation of the population. Here we have the madhabs, or the schools of fiqh in Sunni Islam. And when we look at these madhabs, we find out that they are represented in various areas. So what is the consequence? If we look at France, the majority will come from the Maliki school of thought. So in that case, we can have one approach concerning products, concerning services, concerning the conception of products we are putting on the market. If we look at the situation in UK, in Germany, the majority of them will come from Turkey. And the Turkish population is associated with the Hanafi school of thought. And when we look at the situation in the Balkans, with the exception here in Albania, we will also have the Hanafi school of thought. If we go to UK, in that case, for the UK, it will be also the Hanafi school of thought, which is coming from here. But today, the most ambitious countries in the halal food is Malaysia. And Malaysia is associated to the Shafi school of thought. So the conclusion is, when we look at this division, the question from the business point of view is, do we have an influence of these divisions on products and services we are launching on the market? One of the main halal certification agencies in France, which is called AVS, made a comparative study about all the four madhabs in order to see if there are differences between them. And here we have the results, especially this one, the position of Sunni madhab concerning marine animals. Are they accepted? That is, are they halal? Are they prohibited? Here is haram. Are they mashbuh, or are they unrecommended? In that case, they're given here with the orange color. So we have differences between schools in terms of marine animals, in terms of earth animals also at the same time, and also in terms of stunning. Because as you know, in the halal business today, the issue of standing is a crucial one. Can we stand the animals before slaughtering them or not? And when you look at this one here, practically all of the different associations on the left side will consider that stunning the animals is haram. While within the Shafi'i school of thought, some of them will consider that it is authorized. In order to wrap up and in order to launch a conversation, because I have been told that it is a talk, so I'm talking a little bit and afterwards we'll try to exchange with you. I would like to mention that Islamic business in Europe is a very important business, but it is still at the emerging stage. And for some countries, it will continue to be in the emerging stage because of the political consequences, because of the mass media approach concerning Islam. So every time that you launch something new on the market will be regarded not as a business move, but maybe as a political or a proselytization move in the country. So this is why in a country such as France, it will be hard to implement. For instance, for years, we have been discussing about the possibility of launching Islamic finance in France, and for years, that is up to now, we don't have this Islamic finance finally coming to France. On the other side, when it comes to the rituals, especially when it comes to the halal business, in that case, all the countries in Europe are introducing an accommodation. The accommodation means that you have a general rule. For instance, stunning is obligatory, but at the same time you have the exception concerning religious rituals. Among them kosher for Jews and halal for Muslims. So it means that even if there is a politicization of the issue concerning Islam, the fact that we have numbers, meaning the number of people on one side and an increasing purchasing power on the other side, will ultimately force companies to launch new products, to launch new services on the market. In order to finish, I was in Brunei a few months ago in order to talk about the launching of Brunei Halal in UK, and there was a discussion why UK and not Germany and not France. So I was giving them the figures, everything, saying that Germany and France would be better opportunities because the potential is bigger. They still continue with UK. So this is also a stereotype that is very hard to eliminate, because we first think about UK and only afterwards we think about some other countries. So I propose to stop talking right now and to open the floor for the questions. I hope we have many questions, and in that case we can go back to some slides if necessary. Dr. Yeah?
Thank you very much for that very informative talk about the Muslims population in Europe. One question I have, maybe I can ask, when you talk about why people still go to UK, maybe you didn't touch as much on the purchasing power. You have focused on the demographic area, but the fact about the purchasing power, I think, has not been much elaborated. So I think the UK, because as you mentioned, a lot of the Muslims from UK come from the Indian subcontinent, and proportionally, I think a lot of them do well, and also they come from the rich Gulf states. If you hear of some of this business people that are there, so because of that, you would think that the Muslims probably in UK has higher purchasing power, and hence the focus for businesses. I don't know, I'm just assuming. So maybe you want to spend some time talking about that aspect of the purchasing power and how that would so-called influence the business strategy.
20% in London, and then you have about 5 to 6% in 3 states in France. Is that true?
In fact, when we look at this this chart, it is showing a map of England. And this map of England, for every of the regions portrayed here, say that in this very region, 20% of population is Muslim. So it is not 20% of total population of Muslims in England. But for every region, they're giving different colors indicating for this region what is happening. So it is not giving the overall picture, but region per region.
Second question is with regards to Islamic finance, is there a central location where zakat is collected? For example, in Malaysia there's Baitul Mal, in Singapore there's Amla. Is there such thing in?
Good. Concerning zakat, first, everybody knows what zakat is in the room. This is the third pillar of Islam, and as the third pillar of Islam, this is the compulsory almsgiving. And there are 2 types of zakat. One is regular one, and the other one is zakatul fitr, only for the Ramadan, at the end of the Ramadan period. So if you talk about zakatul amd, which is the regular one, in that case, for the European Muslims, the general conception is that zakat is a personal obligation, and that you cannot transfer this obligation to an institution, would it be a country. Of course, in Europe, they know that in many countries they have the institutionalized zakat, as in Saudi, as in some other areas, maybe here in Southeast Asia and so on. But in Europe, they believe strongly in a personal obligation. So it's up to them to find out who are the people who will receive zakat, and they will distribute zakat directly to them. What is the consequence of it? For instance, when we consider the situation in some other countries, is that you cannot collect zakat on a central level and afterwards distribute it to according certain priorities. If it is a private obligation, it's up to you as an individual Muslim to find out who are the people who need this money. And nobody is recording it. This is another problem, especially concerning the United States, because they made investigations in the United States and they found out that some charitable or some so-called charitable organizations were linked with terror and they were financing terrorism. Since zakat has been given in cash, there was no receipt. This was the problem. Today, in Europe as well as in the United States, there is a trend towards much more transparency in zakat collection and zakat distribution. So maybe at the end of the day, we will have this kind of institutionalization, but so far we don't have it in Europe.
Yes. Can you shed some lights on the Islamic perspective of wealth management? How do they view wealth management?
Concerning.
And the second question is, what's the sukuk market in the whole EU at the moment, and where do you see the prospect for the sukuk market?
Okay.
Yeah.
Concerning wealth management, the first question is that we suppose there is wealth. The problem is that we have immigrant populations living there. So, if we talk about wealth, and if we measure it only in millions, in that case we will not have too many of them. On the other side, we can have people coming from the Gulf and putting their money in Switzerland, putting their money in Monaco, putting their money in Luxembourg or in some other places. So that's another story. So we have to divide them in two parts. I would say the classical immigrant population, which is now, let's say, third generation, and they succeeded in accumulating some wealth, what will they do? So this is one question. And the second question is, especially coming from the oil-producing Gulf countries, what will they do with their own money? The question was not, I would say, acute only 10 years ago, because again, the awareness of Islamic finance is extremely new in Europe. So if it is extremely new, it means there was not huge demand concerning Islamic finance. But what we observe is that especially among the third generation Muslims in Europe, there is a rising awareness being a Muslim. So now they are looking for the accumulation of Islamic products. So for them, they might be interested in wealth management from an Islamic perspective. Meaning, for instance, can we invest in this type of products? For instance, can we accept this kind of contract? For instance, can we deal with this kind of partner? And so on and so on. So in that case, we can look at the holistic approach concerning Islamic finance, especially the three prohibitions, one concerning riba, that is the interest rate, the other one concerning gharar, which is the speculation, and the third one concerning the halal or haram investments. So for them now, it may be of interest, but it was not of interest only 10 years ago. I have some friends who launched very recently some consultancy agencies for Muslims in Europe in order to help them where to invest. But it is extremely new, only 2 years of existence. So we don't have very much record about that. Concerning the second question, that is the sukuk, which is the Islamic bond, this is much easier because we don't talk about retail banking. But the problem concerning the launching of sukuk is, where are you going to launch it? So far, we have very few countries in Europe which can accept this. This can be the case in UK because they changed their laws. It can be the case in Luxembourg. It can be the case in Germany. And we suppose it can be the case in France, but we didn't have this kind of case before. But in these three countries, meaning UK, Luxembourg, and Germany, we used to have sukuks. So probably in the future, the sukuk market will also proliferate there. But only in these three countries, not in the other countries of Europe.
Hi, I have a question about who are you referring to when you talk about opportunities? Are you talking about big businesses breaking into the Muslim market or entrepreneurship, like from the Muslim community itself? Because I've been reading about like black entrepreneurship in the US and how it hasn't taken off because of probably social cultural factors and other complex factors, and I wonder how much it applies in Europe.
Good. Since we talk about big numbers, I would say the logical consequence would be that we talk about big business. But being big doesn't mean that you will be successful. So we give you some examples of this. The first one comes from a company that everybody knows here called Nestlé. So Nestlé launched in France a product which is chicken sausage, halal chicken sausage certified by the Great Mosque of Paris. And the Great Mosque of Paris is the leading organization that we can have in France from the overall organization of Muslims in France. So the Great Mosque of Paris certified chicken sausage. And it happened that an association of Muslim consumers tested the product and they found some pork traces inside. This was very bad for the image of Nestlé in France. However, they succeeded that nobody else would know about this. So the image of Nestlé worldwide was not affected, but it was extremely affected in France. So being big is not, I would say, a bulletproof insurance that you can have concerning problems that you can face. Now, concerning entrepreneurship, here we have a big problem, because as Dean Hervé Mat just indicated, I am the academic co-director of the MBA that we have in Manama, Bahrain, with the Arabian Gulf University. So I'm going to the Gulf very often. So I'm discussing with people from Kuwait, from Bahrain, from Saudi, from all countries. And I ask them a question about entrepreneurship, because the fact that we have today is that we do not have many Muslim entrepreneurs. So the question is, where will the new products come from? Will they come from Muslims, or will they come from people professing another faith? And all of them told me that there are not new entrepreneurs in the Gulf or outside. Why so? Because they have too much money. And when you don't have too much money, you don't have an incentive in entrepreneurship, meaning you are not pushed in order to do so. So we have the entrepreneurship, especially concerning halal food in France. And I have my former students, they launched some businesses concerning halal food. So you can go in two directions. One of them is the assortment of products you will launch on the market, and the second one is distribution sophistication. So what they did is, we will not, they said, we will not enter in the assortment of products. It will be the same one, but we will change the shops. Because the usual place in Europe, especially in France, where you went to buy halal food was a local butchery, a small butchery. And they said, we will transform this. So they imagined a very beautiful shop in the center of Paris, and nobody practically knew that it was halal. When they entered the shop, they find only halal products in the shop, and this concept used to get the award of the best innovation in distribution 2 years ago. So it means that entrepreneurship is welcome, but it will maybe not come from Muslim countries, and especially not from the Gulf countries. Probably it will come from the Western countries themselves.
Is there any tight financial regulations regarding setting up an Islamic bank in Europe?
For an Islamic bank, in order to set up this Islamic bank, we have to settle some exceptions to the rule concerning the principles I just mentioned before. The first one is riba, which is the interest rate. Banning the interest rate means that you will have an Islamic bank and you will have a conventional bank. So if in the conventional bank they tell you you have to pay, let's say, 4% interest rate, and the Islamic bank says you pay 0 interest rate, this can be considered as unfair competition. So it will fall in the category of consumer protection. And in that case, you cannot have this kind of approach, because charging no interest will become illegal. So this is the problem that we can have. It is illegal not only with the final consumer, but also within the company. There is one term, you are interested in Islamic finance, which is called Qard al-Hasan. And Qard al-Hasan means 0 interest among the subsidiaries of the same company. So all this would be forbidden initially. So we need to have an exception to the rule of non-permitting non-zero interest rate. And on the other side, in order to launch an Islamic bank in Europe, you can do it in UK because they authorize it, but in France it will be quite difficult because every bank requires a Sharia board. And establishing a Sharia board in a country like France is very difficult. It doesn't mean we cannot do it. We can find a solution for this. One of the leading French banks is called BNP Paribas. They are present in Bahrain. They have a Sharia board in Bahrain. From Bahrain, they get the license in Malaysia in order to open an Islamic bank. So it is possible to do so, but not in the country itself. You must externalize the Sharia board, because within the country, especially for political reasons, they are hard to accept the existence of the Sharia board. So it means that we have some limits today. We have barriers towards the opening of Islamic finance. But if we really want to do it, we can find a solution. But maybe they don't want it. So in that case, we cannot have it.
How about as an alternative to interest, riba? Let's say we do still charge the customers or clients with riba, but instead of charging riba, you exchange it for goodwill.
Hmm?
Is that possible?
Of course. But in that case, it will be a commission. So let's say that instead of having an interest rate, you will have a commission on this. The problem is, do you fix a commission? Is commission variable or not? If you fix the commission, in that case, maybe your Sharia board will say, this is not commission, this is make-up riba. So we cannot accept this. It must be really 0%. Or, if you can find a Sharia board authorizing it, to just continue with that. So it will be only playing on words. The reality will be the same one, but playing on words is quite difficult, because in any case, you need the support of the Sharia board. You cannot launch a product if you don't have the support of the Sharia board. So the Sharia board must be okay that you don't call it riba, you call it commission or something else, but they would be quite sensitive to the essence. Is it really riba, or is it just playing on the words?
Last question.
Last question.
If let's say there is a platform where you can pay zakat online,
Yes.
is that equitable to donations? Would the same laws to donations apply?
Good. If we talk about donations, we can have several types of them. A simple donation is when you give a donation to a physical person. Okay? This physical person may be a member of the family, or maybe somebody outside of the family, we don't care. There would be consequences concerning taxing, because if you give donations, maybe you will expect that this amount you give is not taxable. Second option, you give donations, which is a strong one and a permanent one. In that case, it's not zakat, it's waqf. So for this approach, when we talk about foundations, when we talk about donations, we are entering another set of rules, which is touching foundations and trusts. So if the foundations and trusts are authorized, in that case you continue with them. In France, for instance, you have regulations saying that some associations have the possibility that donations are not taxable. So you give them, for instance, it can be the Red Cross, it can be something else. But this is charitable organizations. For the waqf, it is a permanent basis. So you are giving a donation and nobody touches this donation, and it is supposed to be in perpetuity. It is not just for 1 year or just for 2 years. So everything depends what kind of donations we talk about. Is it individual? Is it just for today? Or is it for the institution, and is it in perpetuity?